Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. In this session today, we'll talk about why disruption, technology, and innovation are not the same. In many contexts, including business, we've had the tendency to collapse these terms. My guest for today will help us shed a different light on these terms and also share why innovation is human. And her name is Wendy Mahoney. Wendy's corporate positions include Executive Director, European Times, Director, Sales and Marketing, CNBC and Forbes Africa, General Manager, Sales, Truden, South Africa, and Director, Truden, Namibia. Wendy now heads Numela Holdings, a global business innovation consultancy focused on growing the profit of companies by enabling and inspiring them to innovate at a faster rate. In the exponential age, things are only going to get exponentially faster. The time to change is now. That's Wendy's opinion and position. And when a company or individual understands their value, is not their product or service that is when they become unstoppable in this new age. As a seminal expert on the topic of business innovation, Wendy unpacks the theory behind what business innovation actually is, that few know, and how to double productivity by realigning people and processes for optimum innovation. What truly sets her delivery apart is that she combines business theory with neuroscience. As an internationally accredited trainer of neurolinguistic programming and lecturer on business innovation. With resilience, adaptability, and flexibility, any company and individual can not only survive, but prosper in an exponential age. In the exponential age, is not the strongest that will survive. It's the one most adaptable to change. And Wendy says, adapt or die. And now she's here. A very warm welcome to you, Wendy. Thank you so much for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Thank you very much for having me, Jennifer. Adapt or die might be a bit dramatic. Though in essence, at the moment, that's what the age calls for.
Yeah, exactly. And let's dive in, because business transformation and innovation is really your area of expertise and focus. Now, could you share with us, over the last few years, there have been so many developments in this area and changes. So what's your take on what has changed and shifted?
Well, what has changed and shifted is that there's growing digitization occurring in the workspace. You know, every day we're waking up to a new trend that's occurring, and it's largely driven by technology. So there's this great fear going on in businesses. They are seeing their margins decline. They're seeing more constraint in the marketplace, and they know that they need to adapt. So they are going about then striving to adapt by different means and not actually understanding what the age actually calls for, which is innovation, not necessarily digitization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So there's this realization that we need to do something differently. But, and in this conversation, I would like to explore with you what also, and why there's this sort of confusion about where to go next or how to define different things. And what I also see is that there's this frantic idea of grasping the next and the next and the next technological hype or invention for organizations and leaders to turn to. But actually, like I said in the introduction, you have a distinct view on why disruption and technology and innovation are not the same. Now, they're all buzzwords. How are they different, in your opinion?
Well, innovation, which is actually a very deep topic. I mean, when I lecture innovation at the varsity to third year students, final year students, it's 240 hours of content. So, though to say, so oftentimes I'll explain it very briefly, and the assumption is that that's all there is, but there's actually a lot of content to innovation. The simple definition is that innovation is the creation of value. So you create wealth either by creating value or acquiring value. So the process is normally defined by design thinking, which is led by IDEO. So it's the first stage is inspiration, the second stage is ideation, then implementation. So the inspiration stage is actually when you have the deep empathy, the connection where you feel someone's pain and you're driven through that pain to then create ideas as to how you're going to solve this problem. And then obviously, what am I going to implement that's technologically feasible and financially viable? Mm-hmm. So innovation is very rooted in empathy, connection, and it's this whole concept of creating value, exchanging value for a stakeholder. So that's very briefly. Now, technology may or may not enable the process. You may or may not utilize technology during the process, though technology is not innovation. So if you're going out and digitizing your company, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're an innovative company, because digitization for what purpose, for what intent, what problem are you actually solving through that? Are you actually even solving a problem? Mm-hmm. And then disruption, which a lot of people assume innovation is disruption. There are 11 broad categories of innovation, and disruption is just one of those 11 categories. So disruption is the singularity, and then innovation happens thereafter. So there are many forms of innovation. It could be product or process innovation, company innovation in terms of changing your structures. You could be incremental, which is that slow-moving innovation that occurs every single day. So innovation is not disruption. Disruption is not innovation. It's just one segment of innovation.
Right. So thank you for distinguishing between the different terms. And I can imagine that there's many different leaders, at least the leaders I meet out there when I'm helping them to implement change or to be more effective in terms of team collaboration as leaders. What I find is that this collapse happens very often, and that the push for disruption, the push for automation, for example, is really strong. And so could you share an example of what you do when you meet leaders, either when you're doing a lecture or when you're doing different work? How do you help them deal with the consequences of that collapse that they made? Because it's a train of thought or a train of focus that they have, and it fuels their strategy and their decision-making process. So how do you unravel that and turn that around?
Well, initially, I would information dump, explain to them what actually innovation is. Though what I've realized lately is to use a more gentle approach, which just ask questions. The art of asking questions is where you're getting conscious, unconscious integration as opposed to going against somebody's critical faculty. So it's what I ask them is disruption for what purpose? Digitization for what purpose? And getting them to get to the realization that there actually isn't a purpose. So why do you actually want to digitize the environment? What value are you creating for which stakeholder? Because that's in essence what innovation is. So just by probing and asking those questions, and how is this linked even to the purpose of the company or the values of the company, and getting them to understand that disruption, we're striving for disruption, but disruption is innovation that displaces. Those are those companies that you wake up overnight and the whole industry is deemed void because they've disrupted an industry. That happens less than 1% of the time in most innovations. So it's just getting them to asking those questions and getting them to their own realizations, which they will do.
Right. And so one of these questions I just heard you ask is, to what purpose, or how does it create value, and to whom does it create value? And by asking these questions, what it does is it helps leaders to take their blinders off in terms of what was my decision-making process, or what was my train of thought that led me to this and deciding this, whereas actually it's not really helping me accomplish what I want to accomplish with my business. And so how would you, besides that it creates value, you say that there's like 11 different types of value, and you mentioned a few of them. Are they all towards similar stakeholders? For example, there are many approaches where customer in the number one position is the number one stakeholder to deliver value to. But there may be certain innovation processes where different stakeholders are much more important. And what we also see is that more in the traditional sense, it's we're moving away from organizing where shareholder value is optimized. So could you speak more to that and what's happening in the dynamic of who we are actually delivering value to?
100%. And that ties very much into what, my understanding of what systemic leadership actually is. So when I was doing my master's research, I was trying to understand what is the actual golden nugget that defines a company's ability to innovate versus another company's ability to innovate.
Yeah.
And it's in essence when a company ties up their strategy, a well thought out strategy, with their values, that you're getting the behavioral shift occurring. Though that behavioral shift needs to be underpinned by 3 values, and that is self-excellence, which is always making sure that as a vehicle of value delivery, you are delivering excellent value in service of the stakeholder. And the stakeholder that you are serving might be different. The stakeholder that the accounting department might be serving might be an internal stakeholder. The stakeholder that a salesperson might be serving might be a different stakeholder. So which stakeholder are you serving? And you might have more than one stakeholder if you're reporting into a reporting line, but you're also serving your customer. So who are your touch points? Who are your stakeholders? And then the final leg of those 3 core values that a company must show distinguished behavioral evidence of to be deemed authentically innovative or to have sustainable authentic innovation is integrity. So integrity means that you are caretaking in the entire ecosystem. So any of your actions do not cause harm. So self-excellence as a vehicle of value delivery in service of your stakeholder, whoever your stakeholder is, because you might have multiple stakeholders, though even if a stakeholder is not in a direct receipt of service from you, you still need to ensure that all of your actions caretake the ecosystem. So you operate with integrity at all times in all your actions, because we all in part of the multiple ecosystems.
Yeah. And I think that last bit that you're talking about, really taking care of the ecosystem, is something that that doesn't really fit with the model or the market that we have in the traditional sense of why we build companies or businesses. Many are there to optimize profit, and that has nothing to do with taking care of the ecosystem. So besides asking leaders about to what purpose or the value, what are other things that can happen or can be done to help them shift in their orientation of why do we have a business and what's the optimized, what's the goal of actually having a business?
Well, Dr. Claire Graves speaks a lot in the theory behind spiral dynamics in terms of evolving organizations, organizations, where everybody is at a different level of complexity of thinking. And authentic business innovation actually happens at a very evolved level of thinking, a more evolved level of thinking than capitalism. So, but it requires the higher the company or the individual is in terms of their evolution, for lack of another word, consciousness, which is spiral dynamics. They've actually got to adapt their language to the lower value level, because the higher value level can adapt their language. The lower value level is not yet able to, because they don't yet have the complexity of thought to be able to. So what I mean by that is authentic innovation. Another word for it is conscious capitalism. So, but a lower value level is capitalism, which is basically the overriding system at the moment that's happening globally is capitalism. The conscious capitalism is an emerging field, which you are contributing greatly to by the work that you actually do. So what a conscious capitalist needs to do is needs to communicate in the language of the capitalist. And the way that you communicate in the language of the capitalist is you get them to understand that, for example, Tom Chi has, he quoted a S&P 500 study that was done on conscious companies that pursue purpose and values and as a default profit, they're actually 10 to 14 times more profitable than profit-only companies.
So there's a business case for it.
Absolutely.
That's the language you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. So start to change, instead of pushing consciousness, start to change the language and focus on, there's a huge business case for conscious capitalism. Purpose-driven companies are more profitable at the moment. The facts speak for themselves. So present the numbers, present the tangible stats. If McKinsey's done loads of research that companies that have more diversity in their boards are more profitable. And there's tangible stats that you can quote for that. So start building the business case for inclusion, for diversity, for empathy, for leading with purpose. And ultimately, it's going to result in more profit. And then you're going to get the attention of a capitalist. Then they're going to be more open to changing because they're seeing the profit, which is fine for you, because ultimately, once they are open to change and they start to change, they will shift to become conscious capitalists in due time.
Right, right. And so I find that fascinating, the term conscious capitalist. It's a new term, at least in this the context of this of the Systemic Leadership Summit. And so how does a conscious capitalist, how does that approach tie in with the systemic?
Well, a conscious capitalist, which, I would say I was a hard and fast capitalist in my corporate career. And I had a very successful corporate career, making a lot of money for the businesses that I worked for and obviously for myself. And now I'd say I'm more of a conscious capitalist. But I'm still pro-profit and free enterprise. Money's great. There's, it's enables you to do a lot. So I'm pro-profit free enterprise, but not at the cost of any stakeholder. So that's a difference between capitalism and conscious capitalism, is that consciousness about stakeholders. And also in terms of value, you're creating sustainable value. You're not creating short-term interim value that's going to generate your profit now, but in the future, you're not going to generate profit from that value. So it's evolving value because of your deep connection to your stakeholders, to your consumers. Through that empathy, you're able to understand exactly when there's a new need in the marketplace because you're feeling their pain. You know that your business is built on solving problems, so you're solving their problems. So your value is evolving, it's sustainable, and you're caretaking the ecosystem by making sure that nobody is harmed in the creation of that value. So it's still pro-profit and free enterprise.
Right.
The best of both worlds.
Yeah. And so what I'm interested in, and that's why I'm zooming in and out with that, is the process of going from the capitalist to the conscious capitalist. And what I hear you say is that you're also mirroring it in your own life. So could you share more about the transition of how you made it to the more conscious part of the capitalist outlook on business?
Well, it was, I was 33 when I was an executive for a 1.2 billion rand company. I was responsible for 300 staff, 145,000 customers. It was owned by a national telecoms company.
Yeah.
I then went on at 36 to become sales and marketing director for CNBC and Forbes Africa. And it was then that I had my third burnout. And I took a step out of corporate and I started doing my master's in business innovation, lecturing business innovation, and also studying neurolinguistic programming, which is just the language of the mind. I'm a bit of a scientist, so I need to understand things. So I needed to understand that when an executive at the peak of their career has, for lack of a better word, a midlife crisis and goes on this journey of who am I, what I need to do, what is happening logically. And I started to see a lot of mirroring between the business innovation theory, the business innovation research that I was doing, and the neuroscience. And in essence, because our company is a collective of individuals, the way that a company transforms is in essence very similar to the way that an individual transforms. Except with business innovation, you have more of the theory and the structures and the systems. But in essence, you're changing those systems in conjunction with changing the individual. So for me, the shift from capitalism to conscious capitalism came in when I started to see the value and I started to see and understand innovation was a value exchange, and I started to see my value differently. And I started to see a lot of value in diversity, that, each one of us sees the world differently. And there's a lot of neuroscience behind that, which means that the richer a company's diversity, the richer the ideas are, but only if you're inclusive. And then I started to realize, well, to be inclusive, you need to be self-inclusive. Then I realized, oh, wow. So it actually starts with me starting to accept myself as a leader.
Oh, wow.
So I need to know where is where's my individual value? And do I, am I stepping outside of my own biases? What are my biases? Wow, so 95% of all of my behavior is programmed. And you start to do a deep dive into how you think, what your programs are, what your fixed model of the world is. And as I said, bias is a big thing which detracts from innovation. And that self-acceptance and self-inclusion opens you up to inclusion, which opens you up to diversity, and starts to cultivate the empathy that you need to be able to feel the pain of another, to be driven to authentically create value for them. And it's that value, the higher the value you create for somebody and the bigger the pain that you solve, the more money you can demand. And money's great. I mean, I'm still pro-profit and free enterprise. But the bigger your pain you solve, the more connection, the more empathy you have, the more money you're actually going to generate. So all of those principles tie in nicely, and I hope that answered your question as succinctly as I was able to.
It does, because what I like is how you drew the analogy between transformation on a business level and transformation on the individual level, and what happened for you, and how you came to realize, am I including myself? I am pre-programmed. What can I change about that? And what does that then mean for business? And can I still hold on to my views on how to do business and be pro-profit? And does that still work? And how am I contributing to all the different stakeholders? And so you went from the outside process to the inside process, and then back out again. And this is what I find so fascinating, especially also what you said about how much of me is programmed, how much of me is programmed behavior, and how aware am I of that? Because that also indicates for me, what does that mean in terms of prerequisites for transformation in business? So if you would continue to draw this analogy between your inner journey and discovering how much is programmed behavior to prerequisites for leaders and organizations. So what is actually required to innovate, to enable more value to come out? And of course, that then there's going to be more profit. But I'm just a step before that. So what is your take on what do you need in an organization in terms of maybe leadership or culture or anything that creates a great foundation or a great context for more innovation and more value creation to take place?
Well, it boils down very much to the culture of a company and what behaviors are embedded in that company and how are they linked to a company's strategy. You know, first, the first starting point is the strategy of the company about, do they actually understand the market? Do they understand innovation? Do they understand value creation and so forth? And then once they understand that, how do we then tie in the strategy to the values? And this is actually where I'm seeing a lot of corporates are going wrong. Well, they're actually going wrong in two areas from my vision at the moment. And the one area is performance management. Performance management is, if it is done in a lot of companies, it's done very punitively instead of constructively. So maybe we need to change the word. You know, it's so there isn't enough. You know, we have these. We may or may not have very good strategies because we don't understand really what innovation actually is. B, then once we know the strategy, we communicate it to staff once a year, once a quarter, and we just assume that they're going to go out there and do it. Most human beings don't operate like that. No. So, and then we're not linking that strategy to the values in terms of KPIs. So what are your specific measurables as an individual in terms of contributing to the strategy, which the strategy is then intended to achieve the purpose? Is the purpose, you know, inspiring? Because man's search for meaning, Viktor Frankl, that's we actually all geared to get up every day and have this great purpose we're trying to achieve. And then, so once we have that strategy linked to a purpose and it's linked to our specific KPIs, then how is that linked to the behaviors that you're trying to cultivate? Because you've got to be very careful with KPIs, what kind of behavior you're driving, because you've got these values around your wall or in your bathroom that nobody actually lives them or breathes them, nobody understands them because social constructs are different for all of us. Do staff understand them? What does it mean in your job function? And how do you live out integrity in your specific job function in a way that's measurable? And then do I provide you the support? Am I providing you enough leadership? And that's the second area that we're lacking. We have a severe lack of leadership skills, which is a big problem with the millennials at the moment. So then once I understand all of those concepts, I understand, strategy, innovation, I've infused it into the KPIs, I've linked in the values, great. Then how am I supporting my staff member? Do I think a quarterly review is sufficient? It's absolutely not sufficient. Am I having, touch-based sessions weekly or fortnightly with that staff member to understand how are you progressing, yes or no? And if you're not progressing, what do we need to do? Or if it's yourself, how are you going to achieve this better? And how do I inspire you, or how do I enable you? What more do you need? We don't have enough of that happening in companies, which again leads to what I said. The second challenge is we don't have enough strong leaders. And millennials call for strong leaders. And having lectured to millennials, I'm very confused as to why our baby boomers and our Gen Xers have such a resistance towards millennials, because all they see millennials as not having a lot of resilience, which maybe they don't have a lot of resilience, but they're seeing them as bouncing out of jobs. And it's like, yes, because they're not satisfied by just earning a salary. They want more. They want purpose. They want meaning. They want to be developed. They want to be grown. They want strong leaders. And leaders just don't know how to lead anymore, because the old age of managing was so process driven, and you sit in your office and you drive processes instead of driving people. It's a very different mechanism.
Yeah. So what I actually get from what you're saying is that on one hand, performance management, for the lack of a better word, and leadership are two things that are lacking or not shaped well, that make it very difficult to then really tap into the human element of innovation and making the transition to the more conscious side of the capitalism as we've been discussing it so far. And so is that why you say that innovation is actually human? So could you speak more to that? Because when we look at the performance management and the leadership, as you just discussed it, it's as if there are big gaps between the leader role and everyone else who's being led. And the connection is actually a human one, isn't it?
It absolutely is human. So, I mean, innovation is the creation of value by a human being for a human being. And that creation of value is across all stakeholders. So a manager still needs to deliver value to an employee, and vice versa. The customer is also another stakeholder, and obviously the shareholders are stakeholders. So but all of those are at the moment human touch points. So how are you creating value for another human being? How do you understand that human being? Do you understand their pain points? Do you understand where they need development or where they need problem solved? So how human-centric are you, which is deeply rooted in empathy. And that's the biggest value that is lacking in capitalism is empathy. It's the, profit and no consideration for any stakeholder, no consideration if we harm the planet, if we harm individuals or people. It's profit, which is not sustainable, not in the current age. And that also you're getting fixated on a product or service when that is not your value. Your value is the problem that product or service is solving, and that's what you're going to focus your attention on. So it goes back again to the value of empathy. And when I say performance management, again, I probably need to think of a new word for that, because as I said, the natural reaction is normally, punitive, but it's not punitive. It's you're changing behavior. So you want a culture of innovation that is connected to the company's strategy, that is driving a greatly inspiring purpose, right? But there's certain values that you need to build in, like, for example, empathy, like excellence, cohesion, and so forth. So those behaviors, to get somebody to behave in a certain way, you need to be able to have some kind of system, like a performance management system, where you're monitoring that behavior, because it takes about 6 to 12 months for somebody to change behavior once attention is focused on something and there's a business case for something. So that's why you need a robust performance management program to ensure that behavior change actually occurs, because most companies think, well, again, if we do a annual team building session and we do quarterly reviews, our job is done. No, that doesn't change behavior. It needs to be, the daily, weekly, or fortnightly at maximum an intervention.
Yeah. And so suppose a leader comes up to you and says, Wendy, I just really want to increase the innovation capability within our organization. We want to increase the value to the various stakeholders, especially our customer. But we want to work on this on a regular basis and to really leverage that capability, but we need to grow it also. And so one of the things you just mentioned is we need to have a system in place that looks at behavior change towards creating more value. But where do we start? Where do we actually start building our innovation capacity?
Well, it depends on the stage of the company. It depends on how open they are to change or not. It depends what systems and structures they have in place. If I had an ideal, so an ideal scenario would be the first thing that I do is build the business case. Build the business case for these concepts. Because our neurology is geared to we first need the why. Why are we actually doing this? For what purpose? What exactly is it? And then how do we do it? And then what are the questions thereafter? What if this happens? What if that happens? So we get in that, it's called the format process. And whenever you're lecturing, that you give information in a why, what, how, and what format. So the first ideal would be to build a business case. Why do we need to innovate? What is the value of empathy? What is the value of having a purpose and having values? And how does the human brain adjust to change? Because we're not geared to adapt to change. Our first instinct is fear, and that's geared back to our caveman days, which actually wasn't really that long ago, where outside the cave there could be saber-toothed tigers, and if we go against the norm of our group, we could be rejected, which means we could starve and so forth. So it's just a neurological wiring. We don't like change. So when you give people that knowledge, it's knowledge with experience that generates wisdom, and we don't take the time to get that knowledge. So once they understand all of that, and also what we do is we do assessments, individual assessments, and we feed the information back. Because once I do an individual assessment on you and all of your colleagues, and I feed the information back, you start to realize, oh, wow. So you cultivate self-inclusion. So that's why I'm like that. And that's why I process like that. That's why I communicate like that. And oh, my colleague, that's why my colleague speaks like that. And oh, they're not actually being rude. And oh, and you start to infuse inclusion in your environment and a value for diversity once you've built the business case for diversity. So it's first those elements, and then we work with leadership and we look at their strategy. Strategy for what purpose? Once we've defined what the strategy is, we go, right, how do we now break this down into KPIs, and how do we link your KPIs with your values, and we make it tangible. Then once we do that, it's like, well, what is the system that we're now going to manage this? And do your managers have the ability to be able to manage this? Because it's frightening how many, leaders are in leadership positions without leadership skills. Some people, it comes naturally. Some people, it needs to be trained. So we either then will implement the performance management system for the company and monitor it and do the coaching sessions with staff members and feed the information back. Or what we do is we work with the leaders and we cultivate leadership skills in the leaders and we train them how to implement the system. So it just depends on the company. And it normally, before we see a radical change, it takes about 6 to 12 months. And we've literally have a black and white view on the company in terms of their innovation output, because you're seeing the world differently. Your paradigm has changed and you're seeing the world in this constant value creation. Because again, what I mentioned earlier is that innovation starts with inspiration, which is, the first stage of design thinking, inspiration, then ideation, then implementation. And that inspiration is from having a connection and having empathy with your stakeholders and understanding how do I create value for them in receipt of obviously the value you desire.
Yeah. And so thank you for that run through. And what pops up for me is that I do have a sense that approaching it like that, where is the input from the context? Because many leaders face so much pressure from the outside, from the industry, from the market, from government rules and regulations and all kinds of things, and it becomes really complex. So where does this process towards increase of innovation capability, where does it meet all that outside input?
In what manner?
So there is, when we look at the business case, for example, then it's about why do we want to innovate, and what do we have now? And so there's all these things that are, let me put it this way, it's very much focused on the the business system in itself, and who do we create value to, like the inside out type of thing in terms of innovation. But there's also the outside in movement, where there is the business doesn't stand still. There's, in its context, there's so many things going on. The VUCA world that many talk about, and leaders are in this push-pull of, okay, I want to increase innovation capabilities with this business, with this organization, and there's the outside world that's not standing still. So what a customer wants today and what's value today may not be the same tomorrow, or what are other customers or other stakeholders want, or what's happening in the outside context may demand that we move quicker than we built in the business case yesterday. So I hope that makes sense. But there is this adaptability also. How's that built in the increasing the innovation capability process?
Well, we do. One of the programs we run is where we encourage corporate collaboration. So we actually set up sessions where different corporates will engage, so you can get more of that outside in exchange of knowledge happening within the corporate environment.
Yeah.
In terms of adaptability, well, when you focus on value creation and you focus on solving problems, you're not fixed in a product or service. That's the ultimate flexibility that you can have. So, I mean, for example, in my business, when we first started, we just did trainings. That's, it's from lecturing and from studying all the material. We just did business innovation trainings, and we've now evolved into, now we do performance management. It's and who knows what we're going to do tomorrow, because we're not fixed in a product or service that what we do. It's a bit of a challenge when you're trying to keep your website current. But it's, wherever the demand is, wherever the pain is, because tomorrow there might be a different pain in the marketplace. So it's just focusing your attention on where is the value need, where are your consumers' pains. And, as much as I might be impassioned about one thing, I was very passionate at one stage in training in emotional intelligence, because I was like, well, if you understand emotional intelligence as a leader, you'll get these concepts about innovation and you will lead, millennials. But unfortunately, that's not the pain in the marketplace. I would like to push it to the marketplace, but that isn't the pain, not the conscious pain. It might be an unconscious pain, but not a conscious pain. The conscious pain is performance management. So in essence, we're now building our desire to develop EQ, but in a performance management model. So when you are close to your consumer and you understand value creation, you're never fixed in a product or service. You're permanently fluid. And to go back and what you were saying as far as the environment changing, we live in an ever-changing environment. In legislature, might change at any point in time. So it just means that when you are stepping outside of your comfort zone and you're fluid, you're better able to adapt to that and create the value that's demanded at that particular point in time. It's in essence, one of the things we also teach people is how to adapt to failure, because failure is a big part of innovation. And if you have a fear of failure, then you're not going to be a very good innovator. So we're even teaching companies that to actually start having mitigation policies in place, because if you're wanting me to be more agile, if you're wanting me to go out there and create value, I might make a mistake, I might fail, but that's how I'm going to learn. And we call it, it's I reframe words a lot. So we call it rapid prototyping. So we say, you've got to, also sometimes you become so invested in your product or service that you actually need to get it to market and see what the reaction is going to be from your market, and see them, if there's any legal issues or any contextual issues that's happening, and then figure it out from there. How do you adapt it? How do you solve it? So we encourage companies, if you want to move quickly, have a mitigation policy. Give your people room to fail within boundaries, within a structure, so that they can have that fluidity of movement that's required.
Yeah. And so that is an interesting combination to on one hand have a performance management like a system in place, and on the other hand have room for failure. I was within this summit, I also had a conversation with Brian Ponte Rivera, where we were talking about many leaders are automating for the automating sake. because they say we want to take out the human because machines don't make mistakes and humans make mistakes. So, and we don't want that. So we just want to automate everything. Whereas there are many processes, and also what I hear in your explanation of how to increase innovation capabilities in the organization is that it is actually innately human, and that we do need the human aspects, but it's also a matter of how you deliver that value, and do you speak the language of the person who's expressing their need. That's something that I also hear you say. So with the emotional intelligence, it is an important way to go, and that's not how the need or the language of the value that people want to actually have from you, how that's expressed. So it's also about, do we give the value of emotional intelligence? Do we help leaders to articulate what is actually their need? Maybe part of the process, because what you think you need may not be the same as what you actually need. And I'm suddenly thinking maybe that's also where marketing comes in terms of how you phrase things and what you offer as that meets the perception of value, and what you also need from an expert perception to give to the leaders in order for them to get this innovation capability further up in their organization. So fascinating.
100%. It's if you look at we all know we're in the fourth industrial revolution and so forth, and a lot of your automation is coming and everyone's scared of losing their jobs. But in actual fact, according to WEF, there's a huge amount of job creation that's happening. And your WEF, top 2022 skills are actually all emotional intelligence, critical thinking, how are you able to step out of your paradigms, how you're able to problem solve, how you manage to lead people. So it's all of the actual increase is all in the human skills, which I find it so fascinating that still we have so many in the companies I deal with, so many human beings that are running around digitizing technology. And so hold on a second, have you actually looked at the research? Have you looked at the data? The increase in jobs is within human fields, and the increase of skills is human skills. Your ability to think, your ability to manage your emotions and so forth. Those are actually the skills in demand. Yet, as I said, companies are still chasing digitization, which is now we've learned to adapt our language in order to still achieve our purpose, which is to shift capitalism to conscious capitalism. And we still have a very long way from artificial intelligence, to my understanding, being able to compete with a human being. The reason we, according to all the other species, why we live in houses and drive cars and so forth, is because we have the largest frontal lobe of any other species. And our frontal lobe of our neocortex is actually where innovation happens. That's our seat of our creation. So our creativity is one of the biggest skills that we need to reactivate at the moment, because our creativity is a birthplace for innovation. And too many of us operate from our limbic system, and our limbic system is where we operate from survival and fear, where we need to digitize, or we need to make money to survive, or margins are declining. So when you're operating from your limbic system, you actually move away from your ability to create, which actually means you actually accelerate your demise, ironically.
Yeah. So what I take from that is that actually there's an invitation for leaders, but also everyone else in businesses alike, to act from their frontal lobe more, because that is where you have your center of innovation and creativity, and that is in the end serves the advancement of the business best, if I understand you correctly.
100%, which means authentically innovative companies, they focus also on well-being, because you understand that when your employees are in a state of wellness, they're able to innovate at a faster rate. So there's a clear difference between the culture of an authentically innovative company and a generic innovative company, because again, the social constructs are misunderstood, because those staff members some of them have 4-day work weeks. Some of them, they work from home, they work remotely, but it's all very much focused on the wellness of the staff being. Obviously, they still need to deliver on certain outputs, but the human being is the vessel of innovation. And the more that human being is in a state of equilibrium and in a state of wellness, the more they're operating their frontal lobe, which means the ease they have of innovation. So it's that whole concept of, you can actually do an hour's work, so you can sit and work hard and get to work at 8 and leave at 5, all stressed. But the quality of your output is, you could actually, if you were in a better state of well-being, the quality of your output in terms of your innovation ability would be far better than 1 hour. So, but that's a big paradigm shift, and many companies are not there yet. They don't understand that, and it's maybe they need to understand the business case possibly more. I know we haven't had those conversations a lot with a lot of the companies to get them to understand that you actually, you scientifically lose intellect when you are operating from your limbic system. You scientifically lose. So whatever salary you are paying a staff member, you can literally cut off a third of that salary if that staff member, or probably even more, if they're operating from stress or fear, or if they're under pressure. So the quality of their work isn't great. Don't you want a higher quality of the work? Aren't you then going to have better outputs, better profit, and so forth?
So a lot of ground to cover still when it comes to really tapping into the innovation capability and the process to actually get there from at least the leadership positions. Many, if I understand you correctly, many organizations are not ready to take on this shift in terms of how do we approach our people, how do we approach our customers, how do we approach ourselves to enlarge sort of the context of innovation for our business. So where do you find yourself now, Wendy? Because earlier in our conversation, you said that there was this realization of the inner journey of including yourself, of finding the value to yourself and then putting that outward again. And that's where we started talking about how do you transition from the inner process as a leader to back to your business and seeing what that means for the innovation process on the outside. And so where do you find yourself now with your business?
Well, I said we've shifted from when we first started being focused on business innovation training, emotional intelligence training. So it was very focused on training on specific skills and theory. In the business now, we focus on turnkey culture transformations. And turnkey culture transformations are largely driven by linking up the company's purpose and strategy with KPIs, key performance indexes for staff, and merging that with their values, so that you can get the culture shift. And either doing the assessments with the staff members ourselves and combining that with weekly trainings, or educating and working with leaders to enable them to do the education sessions and do the consultations. So that's where we're at the moment. Where we're going to be in the future, it just depends on where the value demand is. It's literally just talking to our customers and seeing where are their pains and how do we help solve their pains. Our ultimate purpose as a company is we are greatly driven by a passion to play as active a role as we can in shifting capitalism to conscious capitalism.
Yeah. And so we've almost come to the end of our conversation, and we covered a lot of ground. And I just wanted to ask you, also for our viewers, everyone who's watching right now, if there's one thing in that shift from capitalism to conscious capitalism, from being profit-driven to being more focused on innovation and value, what are one or two things that you'd like to people to take away from this conversation?
Well, so firstly, I mean, shifting, so capitalism, is very profit-driven. Conscious capitalism is, again, pro-profit free enterprise, but not the cost of any stakeholder. Conscious capitalists are very focused on creating value, which is more sustainable, and fluid value that is agile, that evolves as the market evolves with it. So that's how you not only survive, but thrive in the current age. And those companies, all the research, McKinsey, S&P 500 studies have been done that those companies are actually grossly more profitable. You know, Cotter have even done studies, numerous studies that you can do a bit of research that are out there. So it is good for business. And it's sustainable, firstly. So how do you then, the two takeouts in terms of how do I get to become a conscious capitalist? So now I am a capitalist, maybe I'm listening to this or not, and I'm thinking, well, you know, if there's money in it, I'm game. So if it's good, if we're going to, you know, grow our profits, then I'm interested in doing the adaptation or changing, because people don't do what necessarily what the right thing is to do. They do what there's a business case for.
Yeah.
So it cultivates, I would say, inclusion. And because you need diversity in innovation, you know, the more heterogeneous a company, the more diversity they have, the richer the ideas, the more you're able to innovate, the more, you know, open you are to consumers and understanding their perspectives. But you need inclusion. And what I've realized in working with companies, because we have done ad hoc inclusion and diversity projects with companies, is that inclusion doesn't really happen until you have self-inclusion. So it starts with accepting yourself. So it goes all the way back down to self-inclusion. It starts with doing the work that you don't want to do, you know, the work that I didn't want to do because I was a workaholic and I had, you know, that was my drug of choice. So I just worked 24 hours a day without having to focus on any of the things within myself that I needed to focus on. So actually take time out and do the work that you need to do within yourself. Become inclusive of yourself. Understand how you think, how you feel, how you process, what your habits are, what your biases are, how you see the world. And again, there are lots of assessments or lots of programs or systems that you can follow to do that. And once you start to open up your own acceptance and your own self-value, your own self-worth, that's when you start to open up to the worth of others, the value of others in terms of inclusion and diversity. And normally then what happens as a byproduct is empathy starts to happen. Because you start to become open to other people's, what we call models of the world, because you realize that, you know, my model of the world might be wrong. You know, if I understand, I mean, one little tidbit of neuroscience that I'll give you is that they say that at every second there's 11 million bits of information, but we're only, by our reticular activating system, we're only able to take in about 40 bits. So every person takes in the 40 bits of information based on their programs, which are largely hardwired in us from our 0 to 7 years. So how we programmed, how we see the world, how we raised and so forth, we take in those 40. That's why they always say to you that you only see what you focus on. If you focus on problems, you see problems. If you focus on solutions, you see solutions. You never see Jeeps until you buy a Jeep. You never see pregnant people until you all of a sudden somebody close to you is pregnant and so forth. So understanding just that then starts to open you up to realize, wow, okay, so my model of the world might not be right, because it's a very myopic viewpoint of the world that's actually out there. And you start to understand, well, my social constructs of what is integrity and what isn't integrity might not be right, because that person views integrity differently. And you start to open up to these concepts and open up to yourself, and you start to cultivate empathy. And that empathy is actually the firecracker. That's the fire starter for innovation, because once I feel someone's pain, I'm inspired to solve it. And the inspiration to solve is the birthplace of innovation.
Yeah. We can end on a better note, I think. So it's about self-inclusion, empathy, and that's where it all starts. We've had a really great conversation about all kinds of things related to innovation, and how innovation and disruption and technology are not the same, and how innovation is actually a very human process, even though there's still a long way to go from capitalism to conscious capitalism. But in there are pointers that actually go inward and outward when it comes to value, inclusion, and empathy, and some other processes that are innately human and that cannot be outsourced in terms of automation and technology. That's very helpful, but that's not at the core of innovation. Wendy, it's been a real great pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for being here in the summit.
Thank you. Thank you for having me a part of the summit. And thank you for all the work that you do in terms of driving systemic leadership, which is also a part of authentic innovation.
Thank you so much. And to everyone who's been watching, If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, then please continue the conversation, and also about maybe how you can be more self-inclusive, and what's your model of the world, and how does that relate to creating a context where innovation can happen. Thank you so much for tuning in today. See you in the next session. Bye-bye.